I will be covering Chapter 16, the last video before the concluding chapter and concluding video that will end this series. Today, we're going to be learning about what Bertrand Russell calls effort and resignation. Before we get to Bertrand's useful observations on what in the heck this means, I'm going to take a little detour because why not? I have a reference, a quote of Nietzsche's I find relevant to this topic, and a dialectical behavioral therapy principle that I want to introduce in order to introduce this concept, because why not? The more I get myself involved with DBT, the more fruitful I realize the curriculum and approach and therapy program really is. So the quote of Nietzsche's is, "What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome." Now, at first glance, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with happiness, but as we'll see, the right amount of effort between stressful efforting and what Bertrand Russell's called resignation is a key ingredient to a happy, meaningful life. So in dialectical behavioral therapy, we have a key teaching called dialectical thinking. What is that? It's a way of, thinking, feeling, being, relating that tries to synthesize extremes or opposite tendencies such that we live a life of balance. And this chapter is all about trying to find the right midpoint between stressful efforting and resignation. Right effort. What is right effort in life? It's not striving forcefully or stressfully. If we're living stressfully, we may want to pause and examine why we are and realize that something is off if we're chronically stressed. We don't want to overexert ourselves. We don't want to struggle unnecessarily, especially in the face of things we can't control or our limitations, right? So, because as much as we try to achieve in this rather short life through our efforts is meaningful but vastly limited. And so to try to pull off too much or too quickly or beyond our means is not going to lead to a sense of gratitude and peace and equanimity and all the emotions and states we examined that exist in that spectrum of positive emotionality. But just because Bertrand Russell's warning us about trying too hard or beyond our means doesn't mean he's suggesting not trying at all. On the other side of the dialectic, on the other extreme, would be living a life passively and not trying hard enough, or expecting that happiness, as I referenced earlier in this series, to drop into our mouths as a ripe fruit, sort of like available just above our heads, so all we'd have to do is sit back and open up, is an unrealistic expectations, right? We have to work toward it. It doesn't just happen by default. And this is reflected in his choice of the title, right? He chose the conquest of happiness for a reason. That there is some kind of struggle or fight involved. We win happiness over. Most of us, by our conditioning or default, are not happy. And only a rare few really are. Most of the time, happiness is a state that is at the end of a process by which Bertrand Russell's trying to facilitate. He suggests that we need to make outer efforts and inner efforts in right efforting toward happiness. In our outer efforts, we're trying to cultivate a better life for ourselves. That's a meaningful project. Again, with whatever is available, whatever that next step or that next up level or next achievement may be. We also need to make, he reminds us, an inner effort to make peace with what we've made with ourselves and our limited means and what ends up happening to us and how it all goes. So there is a healthy attitude of resignation where we feel deeply accepting of our limitations and things that maybe we sought to achieve but couldn't in our life, with also healthy efforting and experimentation. So he'll say a wise person strikes this balance by what in DBT language is called an attitude of willingness, which when we look at how DBT describes this it's a skill that helps us out of what Marsha Linehan calls sitting on our hands or giving up in the face of challenges or thwarted goals, and willfulness, which means stubborn inflexibility, almost has a kind of a childishness to it. It is rigid and insistent. So willingness is a really nice term and just another way to conceptualize this right effort, this healthy middle that Bertrand Russell calls right effort. This attitude sounds like, and some of these are quotes from this chapter, doing one's best while leaving the issue up to fate or the outcome, or putting in one's best effort, then letting go. It's a Goldilocks zone, right? Not too much, not too little. The right emotional investment is being made here in trying. This can be likened to the practice of Buddhist detachment, of which it's so famously known in that tradition that attachment causes much suffering. He has a quote on page 211 that reminded me of Buddhist attachment. He says, even in the pursuit of really important objects, it's unwise to become so deeply involved emotionally that the thought of possible failure becomes a constant menace to your peace of mind. He references a Christian way of saying something that really strikes out the right piece of resignation in this total approach to right effort in life to produce happiness, and that is submitting to the will of God. So, of course, he's going to recommend this attitude or mindset regardless of your religious disposition, and Bertrand himself is famously agnostic, that we should always have this kind of feeling around our efforts, such that we don't get too attached or have a desperate need to make things happen that we may or may not make happen. Lastly, he takes up talking about a bad form of resignation, or a form of resignation that leads to unhappiness, and this he names despair. So when presented with an immovable obstacle, a defeat or a loss, it's understandable we may succumb to despair, but he's advising us to get out of this state of mind, because despair tends to lead toward abandoning all activity. And he thinks constructive activity and experimentation, not taking it so personally if you fail, is the key to achieving a wide variety and a diverse amount of achievements. So the idea is that if we're bound up in narrow personal concern only, we are vulnerable in 1,000 ways, he says, in the failure of our purely personal hopes, which may be unavoidable, But if personal aims have been a part of larger hopes for humanity, there's not the same utter defeat when failure comes. He has a great example that demonstrates this. It's the anecdote of the scientist who is in it for egoic reasons versus the scientist who genuinely enjoys and believes in science. He says that someone practicing science who desires to make great discoveries may fail to do so. Or this person may have to abandon work owing to some misfortune, like a serious illness. But if this person desires profoundly the progress of science and not merely his own personal contribution, this person will not feel the same despair as would be felt by someone whose research had purely egoistic motives. Right? It's almost like, okay, so what that I couldn't do this? Let me pass the torch to others who may. He labels a good form of resignation unconquerable hope, which is different than expectation. And in its healthy form, unconquerable hope is large and impersonal. In 1,000 ways, he says, the failure of my personal hopes may be unavoidable, but if personal aims have been part of larger hopes for humanity, there's not the same utter defeat when failure comes. An example may be that we lose a significant other, right? Or we are experiencing unrequited love. Well, if we believe in the human experience of love, that's really different than being so bound up in our own personal journey with it. So remembering perspective and proportion, again, that comes up so often in this conquest of happiness. Perspective, proportion, trying to be as transpersonal as possible, getting ourselves involved in larger concerns and traditions, and in this case, finding the right amount of effort to apply to our meaningful goals, pursuits, values, and projects.